Well, today I greet you from our new Baptist church in Krakow. I'm delivering this in October of 2017, and our first worship service in this room was last month, beginning of September 2017. It still is a basement of an apartment building, and it was renovated, and we had 40 the first week, which was a shock, and a month later had 50. And we've been averaging probably 40 over the first 7 Sundays. We've had every week 3 or 4 people that are seekers. And so it's an appropriate place for me to present the history of some of the greatest missionaries who've ever lived. Hopefully you've already worked through Tucker's book, Here from Jerusalem to Irian Jaya. And what I appreciate about her approach to missions is many times missions history seems boring because it goes into just geographical locations, to statistics of lostness and strategic steps, those type of things. But really, missions is connected to and interwoven with the lives of missionaries, with people who gave their lives, imperfect people, some of them stubborn, challenging, some of their marriages weren't good, many of them faced insurmountable obstacles, and those are the stories that really capture our imagination and our heart eventually. Tucker deals with over 100 missionaries in the book. I'm going to focus in this lecture and the next one in the lives of about 15 of these major missionaries. Some of them because of what they accomplished, some of them because of doors that they opened or the Lord used them to open. And so, again, through this lecture and the following one, we're going to look at the lives of these amazing missionaries. And again, as I tape this on my computer, there'll be times I have to wake it up, and so maybe it'll keep you awake as you're watching this. Of course, we come to Scripture, and we look at the New Testament especially to see the Apostle Paul, as some call the consummate missionary, as he traveled on his journeys, as he went from city to city, and we see not just strategy, but even direction of the work that he did. In fact, I'm working on a sermon now that talks about the first missionary to Europe didn't want to come here. And that was Paul. As you look in the book of Acts, as he tried to go to Asia Minor, and it says the Spirit of Christ forbid him. And then he tried to go to Bithynia, and the Holy Spirit would not allow him. And then he saw a vision to say, come over to Philippi. And that was the first time recorded history tells us of a missionary that came to the continent of Europe. So Paul being obviously the first example of a post-resurrection missionary, as we would call them. And then we entered into the 2nd century, the 3rd century. I've already touched on a little bit of church history with Constantine, 312, 313, and everything changed then. Up until that point, in fact, to be a believer could cost your life. It would definitely cost persecution and challenges. Many times Christians were evicted from cities, even as you look at Priscilla and Aquila in the New Testament. Many were killed, as you read of records of the catacombs underground in Rome and other places. Well, all of that changed with the Edict of Milan, or the Edict of Toleration. All of a sudden, it was no longer illegal to be a Christian. Now it was the favored religion of the empire. And so the most basic result is that thousands of unregenerate, of unsaved non-believers came into the church. Well, there was a transition then. What would the faithful do? How would they respond? And so interestingly, you have basically the end of martyrdom for several centuries, but you have the beginning of monasticism. They became the new martyrs, as it was. They didn't literally die, but they died to self, they died to the old life, they died to the new expression of church, which was bereft of spiritual power. And so you had the rise of monasticism, and related to that, you had the first beginnings of some missionary activity. Of course, early missionaries were related to the Catholic Church, or what became the Catholic Church. And so I'm going to, again, just begin briefly, because in the early centuries, there really were not many missionaries, as we would make that term. We'll look at one in the 5th century, Patrick, and in the 6th century, Columba, and then make our way through history. Again, Patrick, St. Patrick, we know him because of St. Patrick's Day, but what we know is probably more legend than history. I've actually been to Ireland. I have seen the coast where Patrick purportedly came back as a missionary. I've walked the field that he actually walked to, and I've seen the location where he planted the first church. But his story still captures the imagination. As a young boy, he grew up in Britain, and his parents took him to church. His father was a deacon. His grandfather was a Catholic priest that was married. That was still possible in that day. But in retrospect, he would even say he was not a believer as he grew up in that Christian home. And as a boy, a young teenager, 14, 15 years old, he was captured by slave traders. The Irish had come to his coastal town there in Britain and took several boys especially and took them to Ireland to serve as slaves. And so he became a swineherder. He watched pigs for many years. That was his job. That's what he had to do. And because of the time just out there all day with these pigs, he had a lot of time to think. He began to question who he was, who God was. He began to pray. And it was at that time that God began to work in his heart. And for 6 years, he served his family there as a swineherder. Well, a certain day, he just felt the Lord impress upon him he needed to escape from slavery. He had to go back home. And so in a treacherous voyage, he made his way to the coast. Miraculously, he found passage on a ship and was able to go home. Of course, it was great to be home, be out from under the slavery in which really he lived his teen years. But while he was back in Britain, he had a Macedonian-type call experience, much like Paul did, that led him to Europe. It led Patrick back to Ireland. And in this vision he talks about, he heard a voice that said, "Please, holy boy, come and walk among us again." And so he returned to what at that time was virtually the ends of the earth and beyond the borders of the empire. And he went back as a missionary. The culture of Ireland of that day was dominated by pagan practices, druids, shamans, like witch doctors, very spiritist directed, even in nature, these type things. There were legends that surrounded almost every phenomena that was there. And Patrick came and confronted these druids, these cultural shamans. Now again, sometimes it's hard to separate the legend and the reality. In fact, some even believe there were two Patricks that were separated by a few years. Again, it's hard to unravel all of that. A couple of more predominant legends or teachings. One, it probably is true, that he used the clover leaf, the three-leaf clover, to illustrate the Trinity, because obviously that was a new understanding to the pagan Irish. One of the more interesting ones is that he drove out all the snakes on the island. And some people say, well, there aren't any snakes today, so maybe it's true, but there probably never were snakes that far north. What we do know is that at his death, there were over 200 churches that had been founded there, and over 100,000 converts had been baptized. Also, a new approach to missions developed. There was an uncommon zeal that developed from his disciples. And so they went out, interestingly, to Britain, where Patrick was from, as missionaries, but also to Iceland and to the continent. And so in a century of very little mission activity, we do see Patrick emerging as a great example of a life that was surrendered, a life that was given in service. Well, a century later, or the next century, another Irishman, Columba, is probably the most noted missionary of that century. He was born in 521 to nobility, and so he was born into wealth and into a Christian family. He was ordained as a deacon and then later as a priest. And actually, he planted several churches there in Ireland up into his 40s. Now again, his personality was different than many. He had a military background, a military nature. From Tucker's book, there's an interesting quote on page 41. He was a fighter as well as a saint, a man of powerful frame and mighty voice. His hot temper drew him into many quarrels, at last into a war with King Diarmid. A battle was fought in which we are told 5,000 men were killed. Columba, though victorious, fled from Ireland in 563, and he resolved to convert as many souls as had fallen in that engagement in Kulturevna. And so he committed to see at least 5,000 come to faith because of his rashness that led to a war in which that many were killed. He also was engaged in confrontation with the pagan Druids and even converted the Scottish king of that day, Brud. That's an interesting story, again, that Tucker recounts how Columba is refused entrance into the city, but eventually is allowed to go in, and he shares the gospel, and they come to faith. Again, the Celtic approach was innovative. It was different from the general Catholic approach in that day. In fact, I want to read out of Tucker's book, page 41, a lengthy quote, but an interesting one that talks about methodology. Where she writes, their method was to visit a country and where it seemed suitable, fund a missionary village. In the center, they built a simple wooden church around which were clustered schoolrooms and huts for the monks, who were the builders, preachers, and teachers. Outside this circle, as required, dwellings were built for the students and their families who gradually gathered around them. The whole was enclosed by a wall, but the colony often spread beyond the original enclosure. Groups of 12 monks would go out, each under the leadership of an abbot, to open up fresh fields for the gospel. Those who remained taught in the school, and as soon as they had sufficiently learned the language of the peoples among whom they were, translated and wrote out portions of Scripture and also hymns, which they taught to their scholars. They were free to marry or to remain single. Many remained single so that they might have greater liberty for the work. When some converts were made, the missionaries chose from among them small groups of young men who had ability, trained them specially in some handicraft and in languages, and taught them the Bible and how to explain it to others, so that they might be able to work among their own people. They delayed baptism until those professing faith had received a certain amount of instruction and had given some proof of steadfastness. They avoided attacking the religions of the people, counting it more profitable to preach the truth to them than to expose their errors. They accepted the Holy Scriptures as the source of faith and life and preached justification by faith. They did not take part in politics or appeal to the state for aid. All this work in its origin and progress, though it had developed some features alien to New Testament teaching and apostolic example, was independent of Rome and different in important aspects from the Roman Catholic system. So again, interestingly, they would have considered themselves Roman Catholics, part of the Roman Catholic Church, but their approach was very different. And because of that, later challenges developed between the Celtic Church and the Roman Catholic Church. All right, the next character is in the 7th century. Boniface is his name, sometimes called the greatest missionary of the Dark Ages. Again, this was largely a period bereft of missionary activity. Boniface, sometimes called Winfried, was born in Devonshire, England. So again, you're up in the islands, the British Isles is his origin. He was extremely gifted and offered choice posts in England, but was called to evangelize on the continent. Interestingly, his first attempt ended in failure. He went to part of Germany, did not succeed and did not last, and so he returned to England. 3 years later, he returned, but this time he went to Rome first, to the Vatican, the head of the Catholic Church, and there he received the Pope's blessing, and so he went with greater authority, which he said was important for his future success. He evangelized in what's modern-day Germany. It was later consecrated by the Pope, by the Roman Catholic Church, as a missionary bishop in Germany. He first appealed to the aristocracy, to the leaders of the culture because of their influence, and tried to adjust his message to the Germanic, which again was a pagan culture. The animism and syncretism of the young church finally led to what's called a power encounter. And you will see this in different parts of history. You see it in the Bible, in the Old Testament, when Elijah in the province of Baal, and he prays, and the Lord rains down fire. That's called a power encounter, when the forces of darkness, the forces of God come together. Well, in this case, Boniface gathered a large crowd at Geismar because there was a sacred oak tree there that purportedly was of the thunder god. And so people prayed to this, called Donner's Oak or Thor's Oak, and it was a center of pagan worship. Well, he went and he cut down the tree in front of everyone, and everyone thought he was going to be struck dead by this. Now, the reality is he cut down the tree. Now, the legend that goes with it was that the tree burst into 4 parts, which made the shape of a cross. Another one states that the wood from that tree was used to build a chapel. Now, that could possibly be true. Later, Boniface corrected the first to say it actually took him hours to cut down the tree. But the reality was he stood up against the pagan religion, could have been killed for it, definitely persecuted, and yet because of that, many began to listen and to believe. He went on to destroy other pagan strongholds and shrines. In later life, he mellowed, like many do, and he began to engage more in a cultural dialogue instead of just a polemic or an attack. He established also monastic orders there and settlements similar to that described by the Celtics. The only truly innovative aspect of his approach was the influential place that women had in ministry. Up until this part, it was mostly a male-dominated enterprise, but ladies also served and took responsibility for part of the ministry. He strongly opposed the marriage of priests, which the Celtics allowed, and even called them false prophets sometimes. So again, you see some different personalities here. In 753, he returned to Friesland, and that was the place where he'd gone originally, and he failed. Remember that? And he went back home. Well, in 753, he returned to that place where he'd failed, and he began to share again. Well, he was setting up there for his first service, and he and his group of followers were attacked and killed by armed bandits. Interestingly, King Charlemagne ascended to the throne less than 20 years later, and this zeal continued and actually reached its height. So again, in that century, Boniface or Winfried would have been a great representative of the missionary movement. Now, moving forward, a name that's important to remember is Cyril. Again, if that sounds familiar, today we get the Russian alphabet. We call it Cyrillic. And Cyril and his brother Methodius were sent out in 863, and they were sent from northern Greece. In the Bible, there's a city called Thessalonica. Today it's called Thessaloniki, and a beautiful city not far from the coast. And these two brothers were sent from the church of St. Demetrius, and they went north with the Christian faith. They spoke Greek, but also Slavonic, which was a general Slavic language they had developed. It's interesting, sometimes I hear people say that Cyril, or sometimes called Saint Cyril, invented the Russian language, as if people didn't talk until he arrived. Well, obviously people spoke, they just didn't have an alphabet, they didn't have a written language. And so these two brothers went up north. By the time they got to what is present-day Germany, the Western Church, the Catholic Church, already had missionaries there, and they had a little different view, even by this time, between the East and the West. And so they turned their attention more to the East, to the Slavic countries, Bulgaria, and then up into Serbia, Romania, and then, of course, present-day Ukraine, Belarus, and then into Russia. Again, largely influential because introducing the Eastern style of the faith. And later, Prince Vladimir from Kiev is also going to invite others from Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, to bring that version. That is why, to this very day, the Orthodox Church is the strongest in all the world in that part of Eastern Europe and into Russia. And in fact, Moscow to this day, by the Orthodox, is called the Third Rome, because the first Rome fell, it says, because of heresy. The second Rome was Constantinople, which fell in the 15th century, and it was because they believed of compromise with the true doctrines of faith. And then Moscow became the center the Orthodox Church, and remains that to this day, and it is said that and it will never fall. Of course, we know that this whole world is going to fall at the end of time. And so Cyril and Methodius are very important because they took the Christian faith as missionaries, especially to the Slavs, to the Slavic people there in the 9th century. All right, shifting gears, the next missionary's name is Raymond Lowe. And again, remembering your history, in the 7th century, the landscape of the world changed drastically because of the conquest of Islam. You have that story with Muhammad and the Hajj and the fleeing, and then not long after his death, in fact very quickly, they began to take by force different parts of Middle East, Northern Africa, all the way up into Spain, and then eventually the Ottomans would go up into Europe, and were finally turned back at the Battle of Vienna, and actually the heroes of that battle were the Poles, who came down, Jan Sobieski and his troops, to turn back the spread of Islam. But Raymond Lowe is one of the first who is going to engage the Muslims with the gospel. Well, obviously, not unlike today, because of the conquest, there was great hatred between, quote, Christian lands and Muslim lands. Because there was not an attempt by Islam to persuade people. It was through conquering. That, in fact, it's been said that both the Muslim church and the Christian church grow by the sword. The Muslim church grows, or the mosque grows, when they take people by force, and the Christian church grows when people are martyred by the sword. And so it is an interesting take. But very little was done among Muslims for hundreds of years, even into the 13th century. Now, Francis of Assisi, who is a well-known Catholic monk, had several attempts, 3 actually unsuccessful attempts, to present the gospel in love to Islamic leaders, even appearing before the Sultan of Egypt of his day, but was unsuccessful. But his example influenced Raymond Lowe. Lowe was born in 1232 to a wealthy Roman Catholic family on the island of Majorca, which is a Spanish island. He actually served in the court of the Spanish king, but unfortunately his life was extremely immoral, and it was later in life, or actually as a young man, but after years of profligate, immoral living, he actually had a vision, or a series of visions, and in these, appearing to him was the crucified Christ. And again, in that time, the general approach was the Crusades. Okay, the Muslims took over by force. The church needs to retake by force. But Lowe concluded that the conquest of the Holy Land ought to be attempted by love and prayers and the pouring out of tears and blood. So he studied Arabic, a very challenging language, for 9 years. And in fact, one of the interesting episodes that Tucker recounts is that he even had a slave that was his teacher. And they got into an argument, and his slave was actually imprisoned, and with fear of retribution, he actually killed himself. And so that was a very difficult episode in Lowe's life and in his development. Again, by this time he was already in his 40s when he began to engage the Saracens, or the Muslims, with the gospel. He had a 3-pronged approach that he used to engage them: apologetics, that of defending the faith oftentimes through argument, through contrast, through comparison, through educational endeavors, trying to raise up through education, whether it's logic or other disciplines that will help people to read, for example, and through that get a hearing. And then the 3rd prong is through evangelism, through simply bringing the claims of the gospel to bear in that Muslim society. He wrote over 60 books on theology. He painstakingly, point by point, tried to explain, especially the more difficult doctrines for Muslims who are listening to a Christian witness. The Trinity, the Incarnation, Jesus is the Son of God. Well, to them, the Son of God means that God and Mary, for example, had relations, which is totally forbidden in their understanding. And so Law was very patient and yet very clear to go through these doctrinal foundations for the Christian faith. He also developed a monastery there on the island of Majorca, and there he trained others to be missionaries to the Muslims. Again, interestingly, not unlike Boniface, he began to load his belongings onto a ship that was heading to Tunis. And it was loaded, it was about ready to go, and he had a panic attack, and so he unloaded everything, and the ship sailed without him. Well, he was heartsick, and he just prayed, and finally the Lord said, "You need to go," and he committed that the next ship he would go, and he did. And so he took all of his belongings there that he had. When he arrived, he approached the leading clerics of Islam there, and he asked if he could debate or discuss with them the tenets of the Christian faith, and they agreed. And some were open to ongoing dialogue. Obviously, others were angry. Some seized him and actually threw him into prison. He escaped and hid out for a while. And then finally, he made his way to Italy, to Naples, and he lived there for a while teaching, and then moved on to France. Well, he was gone for about 15 years. And finally, at the age of 75, he returned to North Africa, to Algiers. And again, he started with love, seeking to befriend and share the story of grace. But he was also very frank and very bold. For example, one of his approaches was he would hold up the Ten Commandments. And then one by one, he would go through how Muhammad broke each one of them. Of course, that didn't endear him to most of his listeners. He again was imprisoned, but because of his age, was basically exiled, sent back to Europe. Well, 7 years later, again now in his 80s, he traveled one more time back to try again to share the hope that the gospel gives. And he worked quietly for a while with a small band of converts. Then finally, he couldn't help himself, and he stood publicly, and he began to preach and testify and show the errors of Islam and the truth of the Christian faith. Well, on June the 30th, 1315, he was taken outside the city of Bujia, and he was stoned to death as a martyr. The modern city there is Bigaya or Bigaret, which is in the Kabyle region of Algeria. And interestingly, there has been a movement of the Christian faith among the Kabyle Berbers more than a decade long now. And more have come to faith out of that people group than any other probably in North Africa. And so it is just fascinating to see seeds that were sown that long ago are now bearing fruit. Well, let's fast forward to William Carey, sometimes called the father of the modern missionary movement. Again, one of the spots that you have watched or will watch is from Leicester, where Carey was actually a pastor back before he went overseas. He was born in 1761 in Northampton, England. His father was a weaver. Again, lower income, life was very simple. Carey was apprenticed at the age of 16 to a shoemaker, and so he began to work on making shoes, and that became his trade. They were church attenders, but it was really while he was working that Carey came under the influence of another apprentice who was a part of the Baptist dissenters, as they were called at that time. Carey married his boss, his sister-in-law. Her name was Dorothy, and she was 5 years older than he was. And it was not a match made in heaven. Even while he worked, he laid out his Bible and the book of Captain Cook's Voyages and began to study both. He became a bivocational pastor, and so he continued working at the shoe store and then also pastoring a church, and then he was pastoring 2 churches as well. And as he was studying both the Bible and Cook's Voyages, he became convinced that the heathen, as they were called, those who never heard, had the right to hear the gospel. Well, he stood at the associational meeting, a group of pastors from that region of England, and passionately called for them to send out people, missionaries, to go to, quote, the heathen. Again, the story is told, in some debate whether it's true, that a senior pastor, an older pastor, stood up at that meeting and said, "Young man, sit down. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he will do it without your aid or mine." Now, again, that would have been the hyper-Calvinism that is all predestined, so therefore it doesn't matter what the church does or doesn't do in obedience to the Great Commission. Well, Carey would not be silenced. He went home and he wrote an 87-page pamphlet, and the title is about this long: An Inquiry into the Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens. And then actually at another associational meeting, not too long after that one, he preached the keynote sermon out of the book of Isaiah 54, 2 and 3. And it's a very famous sermon to this day with 2 points: expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. And in fact, it's been called the deathless sermon because it was just circulated and circulated, and the fervor for a missions vision finally began to take root. Actually, at that same meeting the next day, Carey and Andrew Fuller and others came together to organize the Baptist Missionary Society, the first such society of actually modern days. There was already a candidate, John Thomas, who was a medical doctor and actually had served in a medical way with the military, with the Royal Navy there in India. And so he was the first that was sent. It was decided that Carey would also go with him. And just as an aside, when I taped at Leicester, I want you to find a fact check there to see, because I misspoke on one point, and see if you can hear where I made a mistake. Well, Carey volunteered to go. His wife, Dorothy, said she would not go. And so, interestingly, Carey boarded the ship there with John Thomas. But before they could even get long on their voyage, the ship was stopped because Thomas had a debt, and so they had to go back, and he had to clear his debt. And during that time, Carey's wife, Dorothy, convinced her sister to go. And so actually, Carey, his wife, his sister-in-law, all went together toward India for their service. At this time, they had their first child was Felix, their son, who went with them. And again, they made that very long, treacherous voyage to India. And it's important to understand, again, historically, into the 18th century and into the 19th century, the East India Company basically controlled everything. It was a British company, and they did not want missionaries. They wanted to subdue the people. They wanted to control everything, and so they often would not even allow missionary workers, Christian workers, to land in their ports. Well, Carey and them landed, and then they went inland. And there the East India Company was not so concerned. They lived in a place where malaria was very high, and actually they barely survived that first year. Carey finally became a foreman, a worker in an indigo plant, and this helped him immensely with the language. They had a son, and very sadly, Peter was his name, and he died at the age of 5. And you're going to see that over and over in missionary stories. Well, when this happened, Dorothy, the little boy's mother, Carey's wife, basically lost her mind. She never recovered mentally from that tragedy. She had delusions. Even stories go, she would follow Carey as he would walk through the village or through the plant and would yell accusations like of adultery and unfaithfulness, just totally untrue and made up. And just very difficult time, obviously, for Carey. And he worked steadfastly for 7 years before the first convert came to faith. Well, around 1800, so about a year after the first convert, others began to come, and reinforcements. Some settled near Calcutta in the Danish territory, and so they began to move to what was said as Serampore, which became their base for Baptist missionary activity, Serampore. And the mission compound grew to 10 families and 9 children plus, and it became one big family. Early, especially, there was great teamwork between these families that resulted in the establishment of schools, of a printing press, the completion of the Bible in Bengali, Sanskrit, and Marathi. Also in 1800, Carey baptized that first Hindu convert, Krishna Pal. By 1818, after 25 years in India, there were about 600 baptized believers and a few thousand who were attending classes and services. The next year, Carey founded Serampore College and later taught at the prestigious Fort William College in Calcutta. His only real shortcoming was as a father. He was often absent, and when present, did not properly discipline his children. Interesting side note that firstborn Felix, who grew up in India, actually later became the British ambassador to India. And Carey wrote, Felix is shriveled up from a missionary into an ambassador. So you can see his father was not very proud of this post that he received. Carey buried 3 children, 2 wives, fought numerous sicknesses, opposition by the East Indian Company. Obviously, he was opposed by the Hindus, especially the Hindu leaders. One of the most tragic things was after years of painstaking translation into many different languages, the warehouse caught fire and burned all the manuscripts. Obviously, there were no computer backups at that time. And ultimately, he felt betrayed by the agency that sent him, the Baptist Missionary Society. Yet, he was faithful over 40 years. He succeeded in planting indigenous churches that were pastored by native pastors who had scriptures, finally, in their own languages. He also influenced generations of missionaries, including a young American missionary couple by the name of Adoniram and Ann Judson. And so again, I couldn't overstate the importance of William Carey in 1792 with the launching of the modern missionary movement. And British was the locus at the beginning, but then all of a sudden it began to shift to America. And thus begins the story of Adoniram and Ann Judson. Missions history of America really dates back predominantly to 1806. In August of that year, some students came together to pray. It began to rain, and so they ran in under cover of a haystack. And so it's been called the Haystack Prayer Meeting. And the first U.S. missionary sending agency, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, began in 1812. And again, a new, fresh movement of sending missionaries. Born in 1788, Adoniram Judson was raised in the home of a congregational minister, so he was actually sent by a congregational mission sending agency. Now, interestingly, though he was raised in a pastor's home, he was acquainted with the Christian faith, but he basically walked away during his college years. He went to Brown University, which was founded as a Baptist university, but even by this time, it began to shift. Interestingly, there was another student whose name was Jacob Ames, who was self-declared a deist, but did really believe the biblical account of Jesus and Christianity. And he was influential in Judson's life to really pull him away from the Christian faith. And so Judson rebelled, and against his father's wishes and his mother's, he moved to New York City, hoping to become a playwright. And he was there not too long before he became disillusioned, frustrated, and he decided he would return home to Massachusetts. Again, interestingly, he began that journey home. Darkness fell, and he found an inn where he could stay the night. He had trouble sleeping that one night at the inn because in the room next to him, someone was in agony and all night long was moaning and crying out. And so the next morning at breakfast, he asked what had happened, what was going on. and the innkeeper said sadly that a young man died in the room next door. And he asked who, and it was his friend, Jacob Ames, from the university. And so that shook his faith, and he began his journey to real faith. Well, he enrolled at the newly founded Andover Seminary, and he met Samuel Mills, who was in that haystack prayer meeting back in 1806. Judson committed to becoming a missionary, and he began to prepare for that new life. He met a like-minded young lady, Anne Hasseltine, who agreed to marry him and join him as a new missionary. And so altogether, there were 6 other new missionaries, and they left for India on that long boat passage. Well, while traveling, they had a lot of time, obviously, and they began to just study the Scripture together. And the more Adoniram and Ann Judson studied the Scripture, the more they realized that the Congregationalists were not accurate or not biblical in their understanding of baptism. Another missionary named Luther Rice was also studying with them and came to the same conclusion. So interestingly, the first thing they did when they arrived there is they resigned from their organization there when they were in India. And of course that shook up the organization because they had paid their way to get there. Luther Rice actually returned back to the States to raise funds, and the Baptists began to take over support for the Judsons. Again, the East India Company would not basically leave them alone to live in India, so they moved on to Burma. And so again, not their first choice, but it was a place that God had planned for them. Burma was impoverished with almost no expat community, very primitive conditions. Even in their voyage, Anne had miscarried and was bedridden for quite some time even after they arrived. They spent up to 12 hours a day in language study and had great trouble explaining an almighty deity to a Buddhist culture. They struggled with the changing political climate and the isolation that they felt there. They had inherited, it was a large house, mostly empty from another agency, and it was foreign. It was just a very difficult adjustment time for them. After 5 years with no fruit and little progress, they purchased a small tract of land and they built their house, which was more in keeping with the other houses of the Burmese. And they also built a small refuge, or really just rest room or stopping point called a zayat. And that was predominant in that culture, that when people would take voyages or they would walk, they would find a place where they would sit and rest, and they would just talk. They'd have conversations. And so when they built this, it became common for people to stop, and it was more natural for them to sit with them and in their language talk about the gospel. Well, after 7 years, just with the life of Carrie, the Judsons saw their first convert among the Burmese. Again, they suffered often from tropical fevers. They lost another baby, and Anne was so weakened at that point that actually she returned to the U.S. to convalesce and to regain her health. Adoniram worked diligently, and he finished the New Testament in Burmese. He and a fellow missionary, Jonathan Price, were arrested and sentenced to death. They were cruelly treated in prison. In fact, the account says that they were hung upside down by their feet each night, is quote how they would try to sleep. Part of the suffering was due to the strained relationship between Burma and England, which again is ironic because they weren't English, they were American. Well, Anne returned and she gave birth while Adoniram was in prison, but continued to bring him food. He was transferred to other places, and she would follow him despite the hardship. Sadly, a few months after he was released, and the reason he was released was so he could translate and help broker a truce between England and Burma, that it was just a couple months later that both Anne and the baby, the little girl Maria, died from sickness. Well, their death started a downward spiral and depression for Judson. He actually went out and built a hut and withdrew from everyone just in a dark period of his life. He wrote in his journal, "God is to me the great unknown. I believe in him, but I find him not." Well, other missionaries came out to minister to him, to love him, and help pull him through. And so he dedicated himself to finishing the Burmese Bible. He'd already published the New Testament, so he finished the Old Testament. And finally, after 14 years following Anne's death, he finished the final revision of the whole Burmese Bible. Well, Judson remarried to another missionary widow, whose name was Sarah Boardman, who bore him 8 children, 2 of them dying in infancy. She died a year after the last child while returning to the U.S. by ship. Judson had not been back to the States in 33 years when the ship arrived. He married a 3rd time and returned with his young wife, who was a fairly well-known secular author named Emily Chubbuck. She gave birth to a daughter and was expecting again when Judson became ill, and he died. Again, Judson's legacy continues today with the amazing spread of Christianity, especially among the Karen Burmese. And just as a side note, interestingly, last Easter, 2017, I was in Helsinki, Finland, for their Easter service, and 3 churches came together to have a combined service, and a colleague and I were able to share. And the largest of those 3 churches was made up of Karen Burmese. And so even the legacy of Judson is seen on the continent of Europe, even to the far north there of Finland. And so again, these are representative of workers on into the 19th century. And when I pick up the next lecture, we will look at from then on into the more recent history.